unlike watching a small child with an imbucare box, a slow and imprecise process of trying to fit the blue block into the hole made for the blue block before moving on to the small red square. "Would I," she said, the question forming slowly in her brain, "would I have to write any of it?" "No, Mom," I said. "You don't have to write a single word." She looked over to me and I saw the small muscles in her face relax. She smiled at me, reached out, and took both of my hands in hers. "Oh, good," she said, while squeezing them. "I'll walk it. You write it." And with that, she stepped forward, resuming her stride. I thought for sure she would say more, but she didn't. We wound our way through a grove of especially large maples, a scattering of their leaves laying here and there on the ground. I picked one up and handed it to my mom like it was a big orange balloon on a string. It didn't take long for her to start in on a game of peekaboo, using the leaf to cover her face before quickly peeking forward with a cuckoo type of sound. "Here I am," she said with a laugh. When she did it a second time, the leaf fell out of her hand and fluttered to the ground. I bent over, picked it up off the trail, and handed it back to her. "That's what you were made for," she said, an unusual lucidity in her voice. "For what?" I asked. "For picking up all the leaves I've dropped." Shortly after my mother's diagnosis, and well prior to this walk in the woods, my mother and I had taken a trip together, 2 weeks on the road, driving through and camping in a handful of national parks. At the time, I had a desperate sense of urgency to know more about her life, to know all of my mother. The idea of Alzheimer's taking pieces of her away before I had the whole picture was unbearable to me, especially because I'd always sensed that some pieces of her had long been missing. There was so much I didn't understand about my mother. There was a specific section of the puzzle from 1966 that felt very unknown to me, what had happened leading up to and after the birth of my eldest brother. But there was also what felt like a general veil of withholding. I didn't have a name for this. I didn't have words for what I felt was being held back, but I had a sensation, and over the years it had told me, time and time again, that some part of my mother was, and had always been, inaccessible to me, perhaps even to her. The ache to know more of my mother had existed within me for a long time, but something about it changed when she was diagnosed. A dull and muted pain was replaced with something more searing. I wanted to know all of her, who she'd been, what she'd felt, the sum of all her parts. And this trip together felt like my last chance, a brief moment in time where my mother had lost a bit of her filter, but still retained the shape of her mind. So I reached for her hand, and together, we walked into the wilderness. Sometimes we're given the stories of our mothers and fathers, of our ancestors before them, and the ones who came before that. Bundles of words, written or spoken aloud, that tell us where we come from and who they really were, what kind of sand and silt they were made of. Other times we have to let the stories rise up from the soil within and around us, from the places they were buried, laid to rest. We have to watch for them as they float through the air, the tiny spores of them dispersed into the atmosphere after the storms come rolling through, covering us in a fine mist, in something we can barely detect. I didn't know how to translate a story that didn't have words. I didn't know how to pick up those leaves, how to parse them out, to differentiate between them and the air I was breathing. But she gave me the answers. For the key to unlocking it all was the language, the fluency of wordlessness she taught me on our journey together, everything that lives inside of a hush. The deal was clear. My mother was to live it. I was to write it. It would be an instruction manual, a guide of sorts for my mother's freedom. What I didn't know at the time was that it also held instructions for my own. 1. A family constellation. It took me 11 months to notice the tear in the fabric, and 7 words for it to rip straight down the middle. 11 months and 7 words. In June of 2015, my mother was diagnosed with Alzheimer's. This was what first snagged the fabric of us.